Okay, guys, in this video, we're looking at an Age of Reform Standard 4.11. We will explain how and why various reform movements developed and expanded from 1800 to 1848. America goes through these periods of reform, both social and political, about every 60 to 70, 80 years or so. This is the first major reform movement in America's history. So let's take a look with those social reforms. The temperance movement was a big one. The issue facing America at the time was we had a drinking problem. Alcoholism contributed to crime, poverty, abuse of women, and other social ills. So the various leaders of this movement, you had the American Temperance Society of 1826, founded by Protestant ministers, and they took a moral approach to alcohol, trying to convince people that it was morally wrong. They needed to stop drinking. Then you had the Washingtonians from 1840, and this was founded by a group of recovering alcoholics. And they took a very reasonable approach that we understand better now, and they argued that alcoholism was a disease and that it needed to be treated with practical methods. That in order to get past alcoholism, you're going to need support and you're going to need to treat it like a disease. And well ahead of their time, the Washingtonians. Okay, then you had factory owners. And factory owners took a very pragmatic approach. They realized that workers were more productive when they were sober, when they weren't drinking so much. And so they pushed politicians to enact policies to decrease alcohol use. And those responses were states taxing the sale of alcohol to make it more expensive and to discourage the purchase of it. And Maine went so far as to even ban the sale of alcohol. The nation itself would not ban it until the 1920s. All right, public asylums, mental hospitals. The mentally ill were often locked up with criminals in terrible conditions. There was no real treatment for the mentally ill. They were just kind of like keep them away kind of deal. Throw them in jail with the crooks. Dorothea Dix took up the cause and felt that there needed to be facilities to help treat the mentally ill. And so states began building mental hospitals and institutions to provide professional treatment uh, for those who could not be in society on their own. Prison reform also took place, led by the state of Pennsylvania. Prisons used to just be jails. It was everyone just thrown in together, and you were in timeout, and you had to wait there until your time was up. And a lot of times there might be some kind of physical punishment involved, and that's all it was. It was a form of punishment. But Pennsylvania gets this idea that what if we reform the criminals and we help them become better people and have better behavior? And so they created these large facilities where they have their own rooms and they're going to stay there for long periods of time to help self-reflect on what they've done. And part of that was solitary confinement. Now, while both of these had good intentions, they didn't really know at the time how to get the best results. And mental hospitals, even though they were facilities to help treat the mentally ill, they didn't have the best resources, the best information behind that treatment. And a lot of the stuff that they did to the mentally ill was very cruel. Some doctors felt that mental illness stemmed from the teeth. So they just pulled all the teeth out of the mentally ill. And with the prisons, they thought solitary confinement would help them self-reflect and realize what they had done was wrong. Instead, it drove a lot of them mentally insane, and it led to huge increases in the suicide rate. So they each had like good intentions, but they had to kind of work those kinks out over long periods of time. Public education. So public schools. States began to provide free schools for children of all classes. Aren't you happy for that? Social reformers feared the growing population of the uneducated youth, and this was led by Horace Mann, and just pushing this idea that we need to have public schools. Not everybody can afford to send their kid to a private school, and society is better off if we have a certain level of education and moral instruction. Schools will also help be the moral guide towards creating a more moral society, a society that treats people better. They even started creating schools for the deaf and the blind because there weren't facilities like this for children at the time. And higher education. Second Great Awakening helped to lead to the creation of many new private universities. And some of these universities even allowed for the admittance of women. So, again, a step in the right direction for women being able to, for the first time, go to a college university. Then you have the abolitionist movement, which really kind of took place over all the other movements. Um, One of the first early steps towards solving the crisis of slavery was the American Colonization Society. And what they looked to do is they looked to free slaves and then transport them back to Africa. And they bought land and they set up a colony in West Africa they called Liberia, like Liberty. And the capital of it was named after President Monroe, who was part of this, in Monrovia. And this was kind of a solution for different groups of white Americans, those who thought slavery was evil, but those who didn't want freed slaves becoming part of the general society. Um, but few African Americans actually wanted to go because these are individuals who were born in America and have grown up in America. They are not their ancestors, right? They don't know the language, they don't know the culture, they would not be. They were not prepared to succeed in West Africa. They were more prepared to succeed in America because that is where they were. They had spent their entire lives. So actually, it didn't really. It transported a few thousand, but not much more than that, and it never really went anywhere after that. So now let's talk about some of the abolitionists, those who wanted to end slavery. And we'll start with talking about three of the more famous white abolitionists. Look, there were many different abolitionists. We're going to focus here. And they weren't all just within 1800 to 1840 either. I'm just going to go ahead and cover this now. William Lloyd Garrison was a big one, and he published an anti slavery newspaper called The Liberator. He was different because he was one of the first abolitionists to call for an immediate end to slavery, which was considered quite radical at the time. Most had called for some kind of gradual change and compensation for slave owners. He said, "The heck with that. They don't deserve anything. This needs to end now. It is morally wrong." Um, and he was one of the first ones to come out and preach this. Harriet Beecher Stowe became more famous closer to the Civil War. She wrote an anti slavery book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. The book addressed the cruelty of slavery, which many people did not quite have an idea of at that time. Remember, this is a time before TV and movies and all that other stuff. People didn't really get out much from their own backyard. So this really exposed to those many who had not heard before the cruelty of slavery and helped convince many in the North that slavery was in fact evil. John Brown was a radical abolitionist. He believed in using violence to end slavery. In fact, he is famous because he killed several pro-slavery supporters in Kansas, an event that became known as Bleeding Kansas. Again, something we'll be studying later. He attempted to start a slave rebellion even in a place called Harper's Ferry. Again, something we'll be talking about later. But I put him in here now because we're talking about abolitionists. Black abolitionists. The most famous abolitionist is Frederick Douglass, and he was really kind of seen as the leader of the movement. He escaped slavery. He had taught himself how to read and write, and he got to the North. He published his own newspaper called the North Star. He was a great orator. He was a great speaker who went around to different events, and he was able to tell people about the brutality of slavery firsthand. And before this had all been secondhand. Here you have this captivating figure who's able to explain to people really how bad it was. He did believe in both political and direct action. He was willing to go to use civil war as a method to end slavery if that's what it called for. David Walker was born in the North, a free man. He advocated for slaves to rebel. He wanted to support slave revolt in the South. He would secretly transport a anti-slavery pamphlet in the South because in the South, anti-slavery writings were outlawed. He did it anyways. And then there was Harriet Tubman, who we've already talked a lot about. She escaped from slavery and helped slaves to escape slavery to the North, as she was a member of the Underground Railroad, which was that organization that did exactly what she was doing there. All right, guys, that's it for this video.